The year was 1260, and the world trembled before the greatest military force ever assembled. The Mongol Empire, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Egypt, had never known defeat. They had obliterated the Khwarezmian Empire, razed Baghdad to the ground, and massacred millions. Every army that faced them was swept aside like dust before a storm. Kings surrendered without fighting. Entire populations fled at the mere rumor of their approach. The Mongols seemed unstoppable, invincible, chosen by heaven itself to conquer the earth. Then, on a sweltering September day near the springs of Ain Jalut in the Jezreel Valley of Palestine, something impossible happened. A force of approximately 7,000 Mamluk cavalry, led by a former slave named Baibars, launched a devastating charge that would shatter the myth of Mongol invincibility forever. In that single, perfectly executed assault, the course of world history pivoted on its axis. The Mongol advance into Africa and Europe halted. Islam survived its darkest hour, and a new power rose from the ashes of the Abbasid Caliphate. This is the story of how that charge came to be, and why it succeeded where every other army had failed. The unstoppable Mongol war machine. To understand the magnitude of what happened at Ain Jalut, we must first understand what the Mamluks were facing. The Mongol military was not simply another nomadic horde. It was the most sophisticated, disciplined, and technologically advanced fighting force of the medieval world. Genghis Khan had forged his army from the scattered tribes of the Mongolian steppes into a unified war machine governed by the Yasa, a strict legal code that demanded absolute obedience and rewarded merit over birth. Mongol commanders were promoted based on ability, not nobility. Intelligence networks stretched across continents. Psychological warfare was employed with calculated precision, spreading terror ahead of their armies to induce surrender without battle. The Mongol soldier was a masterpiece of military efficiency. Trained from childhood to ride and shoot, each warrior was essentially a mobile weapons platform. They could fire arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop, executing the famed Parthian shot by turning in the saddle to shoot backwards while retreating. Each warrior maintained multiple horses, allowing Mongol armies to cover distances that seemed impossible to their enemies. Where European knights might travel 20 miles in a day, Mongol Tumans could cover 60 or more. Their tactics were revolutionary. The feigned retreat, where Mongol forces would appear to flee in disorder only to turn and envelop pursuers who broke formation, had destroyed countless armies. They employed sophisticated formations, coordinated multi-pronged attacks across vast distances, and adapted to every terrain and enemy they encountered. When they faced fortified cities, they brought Chinese siege engineers who constructed trebuchets, siege, towers, and even primitive explosives. By 1258, this seemingly invincible force, now commanded by Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, had reached the heart of the Islamic world. The fall of Baghdad that year marked one of history's greatest catastrophes. The Mongols breached the city walls, and for 40 days they engaged in systematic slaughter. The Abbasid Caliph, spiritual leader of Sunni Islam, was executed. Libraries containing priceless manuscripts were burned or thrown into the Tigris River, which was said to run black with ink and red with blood. Estimates of the dead ranged from 200,000 to over 1 million. The psychological impact was devastating. Baghdad had stood for 5 centuries as the jewel of Islamic civilization, a center of learning, culture, and power. Its fall sent shockwaves throughout the Muslim world. If Baghdad could fall, what city could stand? The Mongols seemed to possess a mandate from heaven, sweeping aside armies, kingdoms, and caliphates with contemptuous ease. After Baghdad, the Mongol army turned west toward Syria and Egypt. Ancient Aleppo fell in 1260 after a siege. Damascus, seeing the futility of resistance, surrendered without a fight. The path to Cairo lay open. The Mongol conquest of the entire known world seemed inevitable. The Mamluk system. Warriors forged in fire. Standing in the path of this apocalyptic force was an empire built on one of history's most unusual military institutions, the Mamluks. The word Mamluk means owned or slave in Arabic, and these warriors were indeed slaves, but of a very particular kind. The Mamluk system had originated as a solution to a problem facing Islamic rulers: how to create a military force that was both supremely loyal and exceptionally skilled, without threatening the throne with powerful noble families. The answer was to purchase boys, primarily from the Turkic peoples of the Central Asian steppes and the Caucasus region, bring them to Cairo or Damascus, and raise them as military slaves. These boys, typically between 8 and 12 years old when purchased, were torn from their families and homeland, but what followed was not degradation. Instead, they entered an elite institution that would forge them into the finest heavy cavalry in the medieval world. Housed in special barracks on the citadel of Cairo, they received education that combined religious instruction with intensive military training. They learned Arabic, Islamic law, horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, and lance work. The training was brutal and comprehensive. Mamluks practiced mounted archery until they could hit targets at full gallop. They engaged in furusiya, the Islamic equivalent of European chivalry, which encompassed not just martial skills, but also the ethics of warfare. They studied military strategy and tactics. Physical conditioning was relentless. By the time a Mamluk completed his training and was manumitted in a formal ceremony, typically in his early 20s, he was a warrior without peer. But the Mamluk system created more than just individual soldiers. It created a unique military caste bound together by powerful ties of loyalty and identity. Mamluks who were purchased and trained together formed a kushta shia, a brotherhood of comrades that often proved stronger than family ties. They shared a common language, Kipchak Turkish, which set them apart from the Arabic-speaking population. They were soldiers first, last, and always, with no competing family estates or tribal loyalties to divide their attention. This created a paradox. They were slaves, yet they commanded armies. They were foreigners, yet they defended Islam. They had been purchased as boys, yet they became kingmakers and eventually kings. By 1250, the Mamluks had grown so powerful that they overthrew the Ayyubid dynasty and established their own sultanate in Egypt and Syria. The slaves had become the masters. Qutuz and Baibars. 2 men against destiny. When news reached Cairo in 1260 that the Mongols had taken Damascus and were sending envoys demanding Egypt's surrender, the Mamluk Sultan was a man named Saif ad-Din Qutuz. His path to power had been extraordinary even by Mamluk standards. Qutuz had been born as a prince in the Khwarezmian Empire, that same vast Central Asian kingdom that the Mongols had annihilated in the 1220s. As a young boy, he had witnessed the Mongol destruction of his homeland. His family was slaughtered, and he himself was captured and sold into slavery. Through circumstances that must have seemed like bitter irony, he ended up in Egypt, where he was purchased and trained as a Mamluk. Rising through the ranks through skill and determination, he eventually seized the Sultanate in a coup in 1259. Now the Mongols who had destroyed his birth family and kingdom stood at his doorstep, demanding submission. The envoys Hulagu sent to Cairo carried the standard Mongol message of ultimatum: submit or be destroyed. The letter reportedly read, "From the King of Kings of the East and West, the Great Khan, To Qutuz the Mamluk, who fled to escape our swords. You should think of what happened to other countries and submit to us. You have heard how we have conquered a vast empire and have purified the earth of the disorders that tainted it. We have conquered vast areas, massacring all the people. You cannot escape from the terror of our armies. Where can you flee? What road will you use to escape us? Our horses are swift, our arrows sharp, our swords like thunderbolts, our hearts as hard as the mountains, our soldiers as numerous as the sand. The response from a lesser man might have been capitulation or flight. Instead, Qutuz did something that shocked even his own emirs. He had the Mongol envoys executed and their heads displayed on the gates of Cairo. It was a declaration of total war, a point of no return. There would be no negotiation, no surrender, no peaceful coexistence. The Mamluks would fight. To prosecute this desperate war, Qutuz needed his best general, Baybars al-Bundukdari, a man he personally hated and distrusted. Baybars, whose name meant Baybars the crossbowman, was a Kipchak Turk who had been sold into slavery after being captured by Mongols in his youth. A tall man with a cataract in one eye that gave him a fierce appearance, Baybars was a military genius, utterly ruthless and consumed by ambition. The relationship between Qutuz and Baybars was poisonous. Baybars had served the previous sultan and had been implicated in political intrigues. Qutuz had expelled him from Egypt after taking power. But now, facing the Mongol threat, Qutuz made a pragmatic calculation. He needed Baybars' military brilliance more than he feared his ambition. He recalled Baybars from exile and offered him command of the vanguard. Baybars accepted, but the mutual suspicion remained. Both men knew that if they survived the Mongols, they would likely have to face each other. But that was a problem for later. First, they had to achieve the impossible: defeat the Mongols in open battle. Preparation for the impossible. The Mamluks had one advantage that no other army facing the Mongols possessed. They understood their enemy. The Mamluks themselves came from the steppes. They spoke Turkic languages. They practiced mounted archery from childhood. They understood nomadic cavalry tactics in their bones because they had grown up with similar traditions. If anyone could match the Mongols at their own game, it was the Mamluks. But understanding your enemy and defeating them are very different things. The Mongols fielded a massive army, experienced, confident, and coming off an unbroken string of victories. The psychological factor alone was overwhelming. Armies that faced the Mongols often broke before the first arrow was fired, paralyzed by terror and certainty of defeat. Qutuz and Baybars set about their preparations with meticulous care. First, they needed to unite Egypt behind the war effort. Qutuz declared a state of emergency and levied special taxes to fund the army. He imposed conscription, drawing on every available soldier. The Mamluks would form the elite corps, but they needed larger numbers. Arab and Bedouin troops were recruited. The reserves were called up. Critically, Qutuz sought and received a fatwa from Islamic scholars declaring the war against the Mongols a defensive jihad. This religious sanction helped rally support and ensured that soldiers believed they fought not just for the Sultan, but for Islam itself. Men who died fighting the Mongols would be martyrs. This spiritual dimension gave the Mamluk army a morale advantage that gold could not buy. Intelligence gathering was crucial. Baybars established reconnaissance networks to track Mongol movements. Scouts ranged across Syria, sending back reports on enemy positions, numbers, and intentions. Diplomatic channels were opened with disaffected Mongol subject peoples and with the Crusader states that still held fortresses along the coast. Here the Mamluks made a brilliant strategic move. The Crusaders, who had been at war with the Mamluks for decades, now faced a choice: allow the Mamluk army passage through their territories or side with the Mongols. The Crusaders chose neutrality, allowing the Mamluks to march north through Crusader lands. Some even provided supplies. The enemy of my enemy, in this case, was at least not an immediate threat. By July 1260, the Mamluk army was ready to march. The force numbered perhaps 20,000 men in total, though exact figures are debated by historians. At its core were the heavy cavalry Mamluks, perhaps 7,000 to 10,000 strong, divided into regiments commanded by emirs. Each Mamluk was equipped with the finest weapons and armor money could buy: a curved saber, a lance, a composite bow with multiple quivers of arrows, a mace or axe, and full armor including helmet, mail shirt, and metal plates protecting vital areas. Their horses were the best available, often imported from Arabia or bred specifically for war. The army was organized with precision. The vanguard, commanded by Baibars, would make first contact with the enemy. The main body, under Qutuz himself, would follow. A rear guard protected the flanks and supply train. Discipline was enforced with iron severity. The Yasa code that governed the Mongols was matched by the martial discipline of the Mamluks. Desertion meant death. Cowardice meant disgrace. As the army assembled, Qutuz addressed his troops. His speech was calculated to steel their nerves for what was coming. He reminded them that they fought for Islam, for their families, for civilization itself. He told them that death in battle against the Mongols would be martyrdom. He promised them that he would fight in the front ranks, that no Mamluk sultan would watch from safety while his men died. Then the army marched north toward Palestine, toward the approaching Mongol horde, toward a destiny that would decide the fate of the Islamic world. The strategic situation. A moment of vulnerability. Unknown to the Mamluks as they marched north, circumstances had conspired to give them a chance, however slim. Hulagu Khan, the commander of the Mongol forces, had returned to Persia with the bulk of his army. The reasons were both political and practical. The great Khan Munka had died in 1259, triggering a succession crisis in the Mongol Empire. Hulagu needed to be closer to the Mongol heartland to protect his interests and potentially support a candidate for the throne. Additionally, the Mongol horses, bred in the cold steppes, suffered terribly in the heat of the Middle Eastern summer. The grazing lands of Palestine and Syria could not support the massive Mongol herds. Hulagu took the majority of his forces back to the cooler, more hospitable climate of Persia, leaving behind what he considered an adequate occupation force. The Mongol army remaining in Palestine was commanded by a general named Kitbuka, a Nestorian Christian, who had served Hulagu with distinction. Kitbuka was an experienced commander, a veteran of many campaigns. His force, though smaller than the army that had conquered Baghdad and Syria, was still formidable. Perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 men. Sources vary. It included veteran Mongol cavalry, the best light cavalry in the world, supplemented by auxiliary forces of Christian Armenians and Georgians who had allied with the Mongols. Kitbuka established his base in the region of the Sea of Galilee, in the fertile Jezreel Valley. His scouts ranged south, reporting on Mamluk movements. When word came that the Mamluk army was advancing, Kitbuka faced a decision. He could retreat, consolidating his forces and waiting for reinforcements from Hulagu. Or he could attack, trusting in Mongol superiority to defeat the Mamluks, despite rough numerical parity. Kitbuka chose to fight. It was a decision rooted in Mongol military culture and decades of unbroken victory. The Mongols did not retreat from inferior enemies. They did not fear battle. Every army they had faced for 40 years had broken before them. These Mamluks, for all their training, were still former slaves. The Mongols were the masters of horse warfare, the conquerors of the world. Why should this battle be any different? It was a fatal miscalculation. Ain Jalut, the field of battle. The armies converged on a location known as Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath, in the southeastern part of the Jezreel Valley in northern Palestine. It is a place thick with biblical history, near where the Israelites had camped before Saul's final battle, where Gideon had fought the Midianites. Now it would witness another battle that would echo through the ages. The terrain was crucial to what followed. The Jezreel Valley is a broad, fertile plain, ideal for cavalry operations, but it is bordered by hills and has areas of broken ground. Baibars, commanding the Mamluk vanguard, understood that terrain could be a weapon if used properly. He positioned his advance force where it would be visible to Mongol scouts, while Qutuz held the main body in reserve among the hills. On September 3, 1260, the two armies came within sight of each other. Baibars' vanguard, perhaps 7,000 strong, deployed across the valley floor. On the opposite side, the Mongol army began its own deployment. Kitbuka arranged his forces in the traditional Mongol formation, a center and two wings, capable of executing the envelopment maneuvers that had destroyed so many enemies. What happened next was a masterpiece of tactical choreography, a deadly dance that Baibars and the Mamluks had planned with exquisite care. The Mongols began the battle, as they had begun so many others, with harassing attacks by their light cavalry. Mounted archers swept forward, loosing clouds of arrows at the Mamluk lines from a distance, then wheeling away before the Mamluks could close. It was the classic Mongol tactic, meant to disorder enemy formations, cause casualties, and probe for weaknesses. Against medieval European knights or Chinese infantry, it was devastatingly effective. But the Mamluks were not Europeans or Chinese. They were steppe warriors themselves, trained from childhood in mounted archery. They responded to the Mongol arrows with volleys of their own. The air between the two armies darkened with arrows. Men and horses fell on both sides. But the Mamluk line held. They did not break formation. They did not charge rashly forward. Frustrated by the Mamluks' discipline, Kitbuka committed more forces. The archery duel intensified. The Mongols, confident in their superior skills, pressed harder, trying to break the Mamluk resolve with the sheer weight of their assault. And then, precisely as Baibars had planned, the Mamluk vanguard began to retreat. To the Mongols, it must have seemed like the beginning of the end. The enemy was breaking. Victory was at hand. It was the pattern they had seen countless times before. The enemy line wavers under Mongol arrows, begins to fall back, and then disintegrates into panicked flight. The Mongol response was instinctive and immediate. Pursue, envelope, and destroy. Kitbuka's forces surged forward, cavalry thundering across the plain in pursuit of the retreating Mamluks. It seemed like a rout. The Mongols pressed the attack with the confidence born of decades of dominance. They drove deeper into the valley, chasing the Mamluks who fell back before them in apparent disorder. It was a trap. The charge that changed history. Baibars' retreat was no panicked flight. It was a carefully controlled withdrawal, executed with precision despite the chaos of battle. The Mamluks fell back in good order, their line bending but not breaking, drawing the Mongols deeper into the valley, pulling them away from their supporting forces, extending their lines. Meanwhile, hidden in the hills, Sultan Qutuz waited with the main body of the Mamluk army. He watched the Mongols pursue Baibars. He judged the distance, the timing, the moment of maximum vulnerability. And then he struck. According to chroniclers, Qutuz threw his helmet to the ground and cried out, "Wa Islama!" "O Islam!" It was the signal. The Mamluk heavy cavalry, some 7,000 of the finest horsemen in the world, erupted from concealment. They crashed into the flank of the pursuing Mongol forces like a thunderbolt. The impact was catastrophic. The Mongols, extended in pursuit and unprepared for an attack from the flank, were hit by the full weight of the Mamluk charge. Mamluk lancers drove into the Mongol formations with devastating force. These were not light cavalry archers. These were heavy cavalry equipped with lances, maces, and swords, armored to withstand arrows, charging at full gallop in disciplined formation. The Mongol column buckled under the impact. Men were trampled under hooves. Lances punched through armor. The careful Mongol formations, the foundation of their tactical superiority, dissolved into a desperate melee, and, in close quarters, fighting with saber and mace, the Mamluks were supreme. Simultaneously, Baibar's vanguard turned and counterattacked. Now the Mongols were caught between two Mamluk forces, enveloped by the very tactic they had used to destroy so many armies. The hunters had become the hunted. What followed was slaughter. The Mamluks, fighting with the fury of men defending their homes and faith, cut through the Mongol ranks. Kitbuka, the Mongol commander, fought bravely. Sources describe him rallying his men repeatedly, trying to restore order, leading charges to break out of the encirclement. But it was hopeless. The Mamluks were too numerous, too fierce, too well-trained. Kitbuka was surrounded and killed, captured and executed according to different accounts. With their commander dead, the Mongol resistance collapsed. The army that had marched forth so confidently that morning was destroyed. Those Mongols who could escape fled north. The Mamluks pursued, cutting down stragglers, ensuring that the rout was complete. By day's end, the Mongol army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The field of Ain Jalut was carpeted with Mongol dead. The spring for which the battlefield was named ran red with blood. The aftermath, a new world order. The Battle of Ain Jalut lasted only a few hours, but its consequences shaped the course of world history for centuries. For the first time since the rise of Genghis Khan, a major Mongol army had been decisively defeated in open battle. The myth of Mongol invincibility, the psychological weapon that had caused cities to surrender without resistance and armies to break before the first charge, was shattered beyond repair. In the immediate aftermath, the Mamluks pressed their advantage. They swept through Palestine and Syria, recapturing the cities that had fallen to the Mongols. Damascus was retaken. Aleppo was besieged and captured. The Mongol garrisons, isolated and demoralized by news of the disaster at Ain Jalut, surrendered or were overwhelmed. Within months, the Mongols had been pushed back across the Euphrates River. Hulagu, when news reached him of Kitbuka's death and the destruction of his occupation force, was reportedly furious. He assembled a new army and advanced back toward Syria, determined to avenge the defeat. But now he faced an enemy that did not fear him. Several skirmishes and engagements followed over the coming years, but Hulagu never again seriously threatened Egypt. The Mamluks had proven they could match the Mongols in battle, and the strategic balance had shifted irrevocably. The political consequences in the Islamic world were profound. The Mamluk Sultanate emerged as the defender of Islam, the power that had stopped the Mongol tide when no one else could. Muslim survivors from Baghdad and the destroyed Abbasid Caliphate fled to Cairo, where the Mamluks established a shadow Abbasid Caliphate, giving themselves religious legitimacy as protectors of the Caliph. Cairo replaced Baghdad as the preeminent city of Islamic civilization. The Mamluk military system, validated by its greatest triumph, continued for centuries. The Mamluk Sultanate would rule Egypt and Syria until 1517, nearly 260 years of dominance rooted in the military prowess demonstrated at Ain Jalut. They would successfully resist all attempts at Mongol reconquest. They would eventually crush the last of the Crusader states, finally eliminating the Latin kingdoms that had existed in the Levant since the First Crusade. But perhaps most significantly, Ain Jalut marked the effective end of Mongol expansion westward. The Mongols never conquered Egypt. They never invaded North Africa. They never crossed into Europe from the south. The Islamic world survived its darkest hour, and with it, Islamic civilization endured and eventually flourished again under Mamluk protection. As for the two men who had led the Mamluks to their impossible victory, their personal story ended as tragically as their partnership had been troubled. In October 1260, less than 2 months after Ain Jalut, Qutuz was assassinated while returning from a hunting trip. The killers were led by Baibars, who immediately proclaimed himself Sultan. It was a brutal betrayal, but utterly in keeping with Mamluk political culture. Baibars had never forgiven Qutuz for exiling him. More pragmatically, Baibars feared that Qutuz would not honor the promises of rewards and advancement made before the battle. So he struck first, removing the man who had recalled him from exile, fought beside him against the Mongols, and shared in the greatest military triumph of the age. Baibars would rule as Sultan for 17 years, proving himself as skilled at statecraft as he had been at warfare. He established the Mamluk Sultanate as the premier Islamic power, built fortifications, reorganized the military, and led numerous campaigns against Crusaders and Mongols alike. He died in 1277, possibly from poisoned kumis, the fermented mare's milk beloved by steppe peoples. Even his death was fitting for a man who had lived by violence and intrigue. Why the charge succeeded. A military analysis. Looking back across more than 7 centuries, military historians have analyzed Ain Jalut endlessly, trying to understand precisely how and why the Mamluks succeeded where every other army had failed. Several factors, operating in concert, explain the Mamluk victory. First, and most fundamentally, the Mamluks possessed military skills comparable to the Mongols themselves. They were not medieval European knights, dependent on heavy armor and the frontal charge, easily outmaneuvered by swift horse archers. They were not Chinese infantry, magnificent in formation but vulnerable to mobility. The Mamluks were steppe warriors, trained in mounted archery and cavalry tactics from childhood, capable of meeting the Mongols on equal terms in the very style of warfare the Mongols had perfected. Second, the Mamluks held qualitative advantages in specific areas. Their heavy cavalry, when employed decisively, could deliver shock impact that light Mongol cavalry could not match. A Mamluk in full armor on an Arabian warhorse, charging with lance leveled, was a devastating force. The Mongols' composite bows and light lances were less effective in close-quarters melee combat against heavily armored opponents. Third, intelligence and psychological preparation made a critical difference. The Mamluks studied their enemy, understood Mongol tactics, and prepared countermeasures. Unlike most armies that faced the Mongols in a state of psychological collapse, the Mamluks were mentally prepared for battle. They believed they could win. That belief, as much as steel and skill, carried them through the critical moments when lesser troops would have broken. Fourth, tactical brilliance won the day. Baibars' feigned retreat and Qutuz's perfectly timed flank charge were textbook examples of tactical excellence. They lured the Mongols into overextension, then hit them at their moment of maximum vulnerability. It was the same principle that the Mongols themselves had used countless times, turned against them by an enemy who understood the game. Fifth, the Mongols were weakened by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Hulagu's withdrawal of the main army meant that Kitbuka faced the Mamluks without the overwhelming numerical superiority that had characterized most Mongol victories. In a battle of roughly equal numbers between well-trained cavalry forces, tactical skill and circumstantial advantages could make the difference. At Ain Jalut, those factors favored the Mamluks. Finally, leadership mattered. Qutuz and Baibars, for all their personal enmity, were both brilliant military commanders who coordinated their forces flawlessly during the battle. Their ability to work together despite their mutual hatred, to execute a complex tactical plan in the chaos of combat, speaks to both their professionalism and their understanding of what was at stake. The legendary charge in historical memory. In the centuries since Ain Jalut, the battle, and particularly that decisive cavalry charge, have assumed legendary status in Islamic historical memory. Medieval chroniclers wrote of it as the moment when God delivered the faithful from seemingly inevitable destruction. Modern Arab and Islamic historians view it as one of history's pivotal battles, ranking it alongside Tours, Vienna, and Thermopylae as moments when the course of civilizations hung in the balance. The image of 7,000 Mamluk horsemen thundering down from the hills, crashing into the Mongol flank with irresistible force, has become iconic. It represents the triumph of skill over numbers, determination over fear, and the survival of a civilization at its darkest hour. In a larger sense, it demonstrated that the Mongols, for all their military genius, were not invincible, that their tactics could be countered by an enemy who understood them, and that faith, courage, and superior training could overcome even the most fearsome opponent. The charge at Ain Jalut deserves its legendary status. In military terms, it was a masterful employment of heavy cavalry, executed with perfect timing against an enemy caught in a vulnerable position. In strategic terms, it saved Egypt, preserved Islamic civilization in the Middle East, and permanently halted Mongol expansion westward. In historical terms, it marked the beginning of the end of Mongol military dominance and the rise of the Mamluk state that would shape the region for centuries. That a force of former slaves, men who had been purchased as boys and trained as warriors, could defeat the descendants of Genghis Khan in open battle seemed almost miraculous. Perhaps that is why the story has endured, retold and embellished across generations. It is a reminder that human history is not predetermined, that battles can be won against impossible odds, and that a single charge by determined warriors at the right moment in the right place can change the world. The springs of Ain Jalut still flow today in northern Israel, in a land that has seen countless battles across millennia. But none surpassed the significance of what occurred there on that September day in 1260, when the Mamluks shattered the Mongol myth of invincibility, and in doing so ensured that the civilization they defended would survive, adapt, and ultimately flourish again.